is already colonial powers exerting their influence on the world in the transportation of peoples from India all the way to the Caribbean. So this is the direction of transportation from the port of Calcutta in the Bay of Bengal all the way around the Cape of Good Hope to the Caribbean. And in this context, the presence of this tradition in Trinidad was itself the result of colonialism. Between 1845 and 1917, the vast majority of the Indians taken to the Caribbean region went to British colonies of then British Guyana and Trinidad, with smaller numbers, as you can see, to Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Suriname, and other territories. Approximately 145,000 Indians were taken to Trinidad over the 72 years of the Indian indentured labor scheme. Most Indians who went to Trinidad came from a north-central linguistic swath known as the Bhojpuri Belt in India that currently comprises the states of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Jharkhand. Smaller numbers were known to have come from Madras, which is Chennai today, Bengal, the central provinces, and Punjab. And many push factors in India enabled this mass migration, particularly the years of British rule that by the 19th century had caused widespread destruction of village lifeways, resulting in poverty, famine, displacement, and unemployment, changes in agricultural and industrial production, political upheavals, and environmental collapse. However, there was also extensive misrepresentation of the nature of the work indentures would be expected to engage in and the conditions on the plantations to which they would be bound. And these misrepresentations were perpetuated by recruiters and the colonial authorities alike. And much has been written in the historical literature about the conditions on the ships that transported Indians, the extremely poor living conditions on the plantations, the less than promised wages, their spatial confinement onto the estates, and the high death rates, which were as high as 12% for Indians indentured in Jamaica. Upon completing their contracts, indentured laborers were entitled to a return passage to India. However, to encourage settlement, the colonial government offered land grants in lieu of this passage, and many Indians who chose to stay also bought land with money they had earned or pooled. So this resulted in Indians locating themselves on in a complex landscape. Trinidad at that time was cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, Christian dominated, but there was a population comprising Spanish settlers, French plantation owners, British planters and colonials, formerly enslaved Africans, and formerly indentured laborers of Chinese and Portuguese origin as well as the Taino indigenous peoples. The only lands made available to the time expired indentured Indians or ex indentured laborers, were rural lands at the edges of the sugarcane plantations across central and southern Trinidad, where sugarcane growing was the main form of agricultural production. Along the tracks that led to the sugar processing factories, where first bullock carts would drive with the sugarcane, then taskers would be pulled by tractors. Indians settled there in groups, forming distinct Indian majority villages. And in these villages, they built communities in the post indentured period that were a knitting together and a re-articulation of identity, sundered from the multi-generational Indian contexts where they had come from. Context of tradition and power, because one thing to remember is that indentures who were brought to Trinidad came as young people, generally under the age of 30, and in the majority as individuals, with a few family groups of no more than 3 people in general. So, all of this background is to situate for us this particular moment that this research is about. It is to situate the people about whom I will be talking, their experiences, and to kind of put us in a frame of mind to understand the larger context and the larger conversations with which these narratives are engaged within this space. Historians of this period, for example, such as Bridget Brereton and Brinsley Samaru and David Dean and others, have noted that post-indenture, Indian villages were characterized by social and spatial isolation. The spatial isolation was first the result of the dispersal of Indians after their arrival to plantations, which were in rural areas, and from which their movement was codified into legal measures such as the requirement of passes to leave their estates, vagrancy laws, and fines for transgressing. This spatial isolation continued after the indenture contracts expired through their settlement on the margins of these estates in the rural lands where they continued to provide seasonal labor to the plantations without imposing upon the plantation owners the requirements of their providing goods and services on the plantations themselves. So they became a labor force that was rurally segregated and segmented, especially at that time when rural urban differences were dramatic within Trinidad. Social isolation, meanwhile, resulted from perceptions that indentures and their descendants were performing slave labor, which the slaves had already eschewed. This was compounded by the Indians' observance of religious traditions like Hinduism and Islam, which were characterized as heathen and inherently inferior within the Christian dominated national space. So I really like this image. It's one of the few images I found of an Indian village from the 1930s. And there are many images such as this that are available in collections all over, where they're postcards that were sent from the Caribbean demonstrating this highly orientalized image of the incongruity of Indians in the Caribbean. But this is one of the few that I found within the Michael Goldberg collection in the West Indiana section of the Alma Jordan Library in Trinidad of everyday life in a village. A photographer chancing across the village and taking a photograph, and somehow it has passed through time to reach to us. So let's talk more about the work that I did and that I'm hoping to present today. The women I interviewed were over 60 in number, between the ages of 64 and 101. They were from these rural Indian villages that I've tried to situate and locate historically and geographically within the landscape of Trinidad for you. And through their narratives, they shared stories of their memories of rural Trinidad as far back as the 1920s, just after the indentured scheme had ended, because it ended in 1917, all the way through to the 1950s. These were the periods in which they received their tattoos, and this ethnographic material therefore offers a glimpse into a past that can shed light upon the reconstitution of cultural practices and identity formation amongst this migrant group. All women received their godnas in association with their marriages. The most common age at which women were married was 15, though the ages that were described to me ranged from 12 to 21. The tattoos were inscribed on specific visible places on their bodies, commonly their forearms, the dorsum of their hand or the back of their hand. The outer surface of their forearm was less common, their upper arm, their chest, their forehead, their chin, and on either side of their nose. The tattoos were inscribed by itinerant tattoo artists known as Nat, Natwa, or Godnahar, which are still the words for tattoo artists in the languages of central India today. Godnahars were women, men, and married couples, and they wandered between these rural villages in Trinidad, announcing their arrival by singing out, calling out their trade in Bhojpuri, playing a hand drum called a damaru, and going from house to house to ask if there were any recently married women present. One woman from the village of Felicity in central Trinidad remembered the Godnahar announcing her arrival by singing out, Godna Godawe, Godna Godawe, Godna Godawe. This is from an interview with SR, as she walked through the village. In Pinal, another participant remembered the male Godnahar proceeding directly to the wedding houses, which is where he already knew there were newly married women because of the tight network of village gossip that took place, and you know, news traveled really fast between these villages at that time. Another woman remembered a married couple of Natwas who would walk through the village, twirling their damaru and singing out, Ole asal to hoibe dat asul ke. And in Esperance village in southern Trinidad, there was a well-known male Godnahar who would drive through the village in his car, blaring his horn toot 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 to announce his presence and attract customers. So as you can see, there's a wide range in the types of Godnahars that they had experience of. Interestingly, none of these women knew any personally. They did not know where they came from. They did not know where they lived. They were a known entity, but also unknown. Where, when there was a newly married woman residing in the house, the tattoo artists were invited by her elders, that is, her parents or her in-laws, to ply their trade. So they would sit in the front yard or the front porch or under the stilt, the houses that were on stilts, and the tattoo motif would be outlined on their skin first using tattoo pigment or ink. Some women were given a round object, such as a piece of wood or bamboo, to squeeze in their hand while they were being tattooed. The tattoo artist would bind 7 or 9 sewing needles together with string. The tips of these needles would be dipped repeatedly into the tattoo pigment, and the tattoo would be poked into their flesh in the desired pattern. This is the hand poke technique. It still is performed in India today, as well as around the world, for traditional tattooing. The pigment would then be embedded under the skin in the design that had been selected. Only one woman, the youngest person I interviewed at 64 years old, described the tattoo artist as having used a tattoo gun. Most women did not know details of this tattooing practice. Two of the more elderly women, 93 and 85 years of age, recall the tattoo artist using coal dust and charcoal. She said, the 85-year-old said, so they well grind the charcoal fine and put a little bit of water inside it. So they was to dip the needle in it and chuck your hand. Another woman believed that the tattooing had come from flowers, but again, they had no specific knowledge of it. Another woman yet noted that the tattoo artist used soot, like you use for kajal, which is a lining for the eye that's decorative and believed to be remedial as well. And soot is made from lighting a coconut wick in a clay pot of oil and putting another clay pot over it so that the collected soot then becomes used as this pigment. After the tattoos were given, Natwas were paid for their trade with money or with goods, such as foodstuffs, rice, lentil dal, unbleached cotton cloth, and the prices quoted ranged from 30 cents to 60 cents. Women were given a variety of advice by different tattoo artists to assist with healing these newly administered tattoos. A few women remembered being told to make a hardy paste from turmeric and coconut oil to apply daily to the site until the scabs fell off. Another woman was told to lift a heavy bucket on the tattooed side to stretch out the skin daily until the scabs had fallen off. And all of these little fragments of information were very interesting because what I found very helpful was when there were a few women who were all together in one place and they would begin to recall as they spoke to each other and as I spoke to them and asked questions and probed, they begin to recall more details about the actual process of tattooing. Sadly, as I said before, I was unable to find any Godnahars or Nakwas. So these details are 60-year-old memories, and sometimes even more than that, that I'm now sharing in this kind of structured way. The next component of the tattoo practice relates to the designs or motifs, and these were chosen for inscription in a variety of ways. For some, the godna was chosen for them by the tattoo artist himself or herself. SP recounted, the godnahar choose the tattoo, he tell me to take it, I take it. Few of these women had any concept of the tattoo motif prior to their application. One recalled asking the natwa what it would look like, and he traced the pattern in the dust under the house with his finger so she could see. However, far more common was the choosing of tattoos from books that the natwas took from place to place with them. These tattoo motifs they were described as copybooks or books hand drawn with tattoo motifs that could be selected either by the individual who's receiving the tattoo or by the person gifting it to them. And there were two different ways in which tattoos were gifted. Tattoos applied on the right hand were gifted by one's in laws. Tattoos applied on the left hand were gifted by one's parents. There was variability again that was described in how the tattoos were selected, even if they were gifted by others. Some women were able to choose the ones they wanted. Some women's the person performing the gifting chose the tattoos for other women. Um, they also received tattoos on their chest, the motifs for which were chosen from the book or chosen by the Godnahar. And these they received while sitting on the lap of their mother. So, for example, 8-year-old DG described her choice as follows. They had smaller pattern in the book, but I greedy. I take the big one. In the book, the Godna print red and big, and I like that, so I take it. When you're little, you don't know how much it go hurt, right? And women often express an aesthetic appreciation of their Godna still, admiring the patterns, identifying different motifs such as peacocks or moor birds and gainda or marigolds, scorpions, and more. They also describe how beautiful the tattoos looked when freshly inked on their taut flesh when they were young, when the patterns were bright. Recollections of when they got the tattoos were as bright and sharp as the patterns themselves once were, leading to reminiscences about youth and beauty. Most women, almost all women, also describe how painful the tattoos were to receive. Many of them winced as they recalled it. One woman, yes, said, it pained plenty, it pained too bad. By the time my daughter was married in, I glad nobody giving good now. I tell she don't get no good now. They're still giving good now nowadays, but only for style. So only for fashion rather than for ritual or ceremony or with a different kind of meaning. Of the women I interviewed, only two in their late 80s had daughters in their 60s who themselves had godnas. When I asked other women with daughters if they thought their daughters should get godnas, they simply replied that it was no longer an option at all. The tattoo artists had disappeared and no one knew where to find them. For some women, the pain of getting one godna was a deterrent from getting any others at all. So DG, who I spoke about previously, explained the absence of any godna on her left side by saying, I had to wait until they finished this tattoo. After that, I take no more. That is why I only have one hand. I say no more. Similarly, other women describe themselves as choosing smaller patterns, or in one case, instead of an entire flower, a dot on the back of her hand to limit the pain. Another woman looked at this disparity in the size and complexity of the patterns on her arms and laughed at herself, noting that she had chosen the small godna to avoid pain a second time. So in the interest of time, I will focus on three main reasons that women described for receiving godna. The most common was that without these tattoos, their mother-in-law and father-in-law wouldn't take water from their hand. This, they explained, meant that food or drink that they served would not be accepted or consumed by the people who had served it, by the people they had served it to. Most commonly, women said this with reference to their in-laws. However, they also identified India people, long-time people, all people and them, which they explained referred to direct immigrants from India. As all of the women I interviewed have been born in Trinidad, these categories distinguish between themselves as Trinidadian and immigrants directly from India. And the refusal of a family member to take something from an untattooed woman would have been a major limitation to the smooth functioning of the household at that time, given the common expectation in Indian villages that married women would move into the homes shared by their husband and parents and participate in the domestic work. Cultural norms of hospitality also dictated that guests be served food or drink, and the guest refusal would have been a source of significant shame. The dangers of pollution and subsequent to the breaking of social categories that function as moral codes have been extensively explored in classic anthropological texts by such as Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas and Fraser and others. And through this lens, the serving of food or water by the untattooed married woman could be considered matter out of place. The absence of a tattoo would be the violation of a cultural practice that served to reinforce the social boundary of marriage, which Indians had brought with them and were attempting to recapitulate off the plantations in the new space of Indian villages. Yet when I probed the standard response, only three women identified specific moments that they recalled when an offering of food or water had been refused because they were not yet tattooed. The time between marriage and tattooing varied widely. For some women, it was a week to a few months. For others, the tattoos were only received after the birth of their first child. When I asked about this, they said that it was due to the availability of the natwas. Their sporadic itinerancy and unknown residences prevented people from seeking out the tattoos themselves. So even though this continued to be the standard response for why they had Bodnas, on closer examination, its actual practice broke down to some degree. The second most common meaning ascribed to Bodna was as an indicator of Hindu marital status. As an interlocutor explained, Bodna is just a signal of marriage that you as a married woman, like sindoor for married woman. Sindoor is a pigment applied at the part of one's hair after one is married amongst the Hindu community. Similarly, RL said of her Godna, this is proving you as a married woman. A Godna was a permanent marker of attribution to having achieved a life stage, the life stage of marriage, of having become a grihastha or householder. The tattoos themselves serve to mark this rite of passage. There is another layer to it, which I think is important to highlight, which is that throughout indenture, the colonial state refused to grant the same marriage rights to Hindus and Muslims as to Christians, and Hindu marriages were therefore not recognized as legal until the passage of the Hindu Marriage Act in 1945, 100 years after Indians first were brought to Trinidad. As such, historians such as David Davidine and Samru have argued that despite the lack of legal recognition, Indian indentures and their descendants viewed as legitimate marriages executed with due publicity, performed according to their established rights and customs, of which this tattooing practice may have been one. As such, I think it is important that we also consider the perpetuation of Godna as a marker of marriage through this lens. And then the third major reason that was attributed to having Godnas was a sense of continuity beyond death. Some women ascribed to the Godna an accounting for their time on earth. And me and other and some women ascribed to Godnas a means of accounting for their time on earth. And the second reason given was as a means of remaining attached to their mothers after death. 85-year-old SD, for example, explained that when she appeared before Bhagwan after death, the Godna on her hand would be a count of all her actions and measure of the life she had lived. As she explained, when I dead, this will go with me and will have to give the count by God what I do, how much I walk, what I do. This is the count. 78-year-old ML stated that the meaning of the tattoo on her chest was the unbreakable bond between a mother and her daughter, which would allow them to perceive each other even after death. I get this Godna, sit down in my mother lap and take that on my chest, and when we die, we go meet one. 8-year-old SB shared a similar meaning. The one on my chest When she give me this, she tell me that when my mother pass away, in she old days or young days, and when I pass away, whether old or young, I will meet my mother after the life now. Probably my mother might say Betty, and she might call my name, and I might say Ma. So the practices and explanations outlined above are actually very consistent with the colonial ethnographic records of tattooing in India from the late 1800s to the 1900s. British colonials in India performed extensive recording of tattoos for various reasons of their own. Those records have come down to us and require some interpretation to get aside to peer through the racism. But there are many continuities in the narratives, the form, and the descriptions that were shared by these research subjects 20 years ago. More recently, in speaking with tattoo artists who are rekindling these practices in central India, currently there was dramatic continuity in both the practice and the forms of the tattoos that continue to be inscribed currently. Itinerant Godnahars, itinerant Natwas, the announcing of their presence in villages, the selection and the types of tattoos, though there are many differences currently, similarities remain. And I shall now show some of the Godnas and do a brief overview of the ways in which these reflect continuity and change. This is the first time I'm showing them in any forum, the original photograph, so it's a bit nerve-wracking. So these are examples from my collection of Godna images that depict the continuity. This first image is of Ram Nam in Devanagari script, which was a common tattoo on about a quarter of the women that I interviewed. This is the name of the Hindu god Rama, who is the heroine and god of the mythopoetic Ramayana, which was a very powerful myth and a powerful source of spirituality and continuity for Indians in the Caribbean, both because there's a theme of exile that dominates this myth, where Ram is exiled to the forest, and people identified with that exile to the Caribbean. They also, that Ramayana, especially the Tulsidas Ramayana, is particularly popular in the region, the Bhojpuri-speaking region from which Indians came. What is interesting is that this depiction of Rama, this depiction of Rama's name, Ram Nam, is less common amongst the regions of India from which Indians in Trinidad came than its representation in Trinidad. More recent research conducted with a tattoo artist from India suggests that not only was the Ram Nam motif used more frequently in the tattoos from Trinidad, but it was also incorporated differently than similar tattoos from this region of India. In the tattoos here on the screen, the Ram Nam motif is stand-alone, separated from other tattoo designs on women's bodies by distance and location. This is how it continues to be used in India. However, in many of the tattoo images I captured from Trinidad, the Ram Nam motif is included in continuity with other motifs, presenting as a singular symbolic element rather than a separate and distinct depiction. So in each of these, for example, Ram Nam is included in very close proximity to the other motifs. Here it's almost indistinguishable from the machia above. Now, two explanations are suggested for this difference. The first, that this embodied invocation of Ram Nam was not seen as uniquely the prerogative of or specific to any one group amongst Indians in Trinidad. It was thus included with other tattoo motifs widely available for use in adorning and invoking the name of God on many women. This is suggestive of a blurring of in-group boundaries in post-indentured Indian community formation within Trinidad, and a precursor, perhaps, to the current loss of caste as a marker of Hindu identity within the Indian Trinidadian community. A second possible explanation is that the Devanagari script itself was becoming more decorative than meaningful within this community, as language and literacy loss continued within this group. There were no widespread formal institutions from this period over which the tattoos were being given to provide education in reading and writing Devanagari's Hindi script. English was the language of the state, the status quo, and the means to upward social mobility. While all the women I interviewed knew the part of their tattoo that signified Ram Nam, none of them could distinguish specific letter sounds within the design or read Devanagari. Some women could still speak Bhojpuri variants that were common in Trinidad in their youth, known as Hindustani locally. Indeed, the transformation from linguistic familiarity with Hindustani or Hindi script is further evidenced by the appearance among the tattoos, first of the name of Ram in English script rather than Devanagari, and also in the transformation from Devanagari renditions of their husbands' names to English script renditions or inscriptions of their husbands' names. As historians and feminist scholars of Trinidad have articulated, in the post-indentured reconstitution of Indian community within the landscape of Trinidad, there was also the reconstitution of patriarchal structures and norms, reasserting claims to women's bodies and reproductive potential through such practices as the reassertion of joint family structure and the reapportioning of domestic responsibilities. Viewing Godna through this lens, it is unsurprising that the practice from India of including as a motif their husband's name also recurred in the Devanagari script. However, these tattoos, as I've just said, demonstrate that for some women, the English script was used instead of Devanagari to spell out their husbands' names. One interviewee, JR, explained to me, "My children ego understand it if they natwa write in Hindi. So he writes in English. Me can read and write, but my child and grandson know how to read and write and everything only in English."
Mhm.
A third transformation that I want to highlight is the syncretism that was beginning to occur in Trinidad in the post-indenture period as diverse religious traditions were engaged within and upon the ground state of people and their bodies. This slide shows traditional tattoos, which in all traditional tattooing practices around the world encode the environment and the social context of people. These motifs include scorpions, machias, which are thrones or seats, gainda, which are flowers or marigolds, moor birds in various iconographic forms, where moor stands for peacock. None of these are indigenous to Trinidad. So these motifs were brought from India with the tattooists and with the Indians themselves. These are also drawn, the machia and these particular terms, such as Sita Ke Rasoi, are drawn from the religious symbology of the Hindu tradition. Sita Ke Rasoi, Ram Ka Ghar. These translate into Sita's kitchen and Rama's home, where Sita is the ideal of wifely devotion in the Hindu tradition, and Ram is the ideal husband, um, which places the home as the center of protection and provision. So one interesting thing that I found, which I'll end with, was that one of the women received as a godna the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So on one hand, this woman had a traditional machia, and on the other hand, from her parents, she received the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which the godna was asked to inscribe. She received the statue from her mother and father. She did not describe it as the Sacred Heart of Jesus, but it is readily recognizable as so and has been found in other tattooing in Trinidad from that period. And she said it was given to her for protection. So I will just end there and just highlight to you how through the tattoos we can see the transformation that was taking place in this translocated, displaced community as they attempted to negotiate the cultural traditions that they brought with them the new landscape and space that they found, and how that movement has been demonstrated through this material culture form that I was able to collect at a very crucial moment. And I will end there.
We're at our time, but we can, if you have time and you want to stay around for a few questions, we certainly can. So I'm going to open the floor for those that might have questions, and those on the chat in Zoom, feel free to type your questions, and Jacob can ask them. Questions? Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
So I wonder with the individuals you interviewed, I mean, you said this a little bit, but
Yeah.
you touched on maybe their commentary about contemporary tattoos, but I wondered if they got any deeper with you about like frustration, for example, with like the type of tattooing that they received being, well, like maybe legal, you know, at some point, but that, you know, comparing that to almost everywhere you turn, everyone's tattooed. So,
Yeah.
and that's just, it's such a dichotomy, you know, the two things. I just wonder.
That was a really interesting point that was raised.
Yeah.
They spoke about their grandchildren receiving them and the loss of the patterns. So they spoke about the fact that now you can get godnas, and they all assumed I was very interested in getting one myself. So they said, you know, you can go to a tattoo artist and you can get one now. And I said, well, what about the patterns? And they said, well, no, not this pattern. This is long time pattern. So even though it wasn't actually prescribed, or it was not actually criminalized in Trinidad,
Oh, okay.
it was seen as old fashioned. It was seen as long time thing, which is how they described it. And it was seen as less valuable in part because of its association with rurality and with heathenism and with this very visible marker of difference on the skin. So that was really interesting for me too.
Yeah.
That they all said, you know, if you really want one, you can get one, but it won't be the same.
Not the old one.
Yeah. Any questions?
I'm really interested in what this project says about like human movement and migration and cultural memory practices. It seems like you have a lot there about, you know, like that are specific to this case, but that also could be applicable to other contexts of human movement and what happens to cultural memory practices.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you could, just say a little bit, like if you were to generalize out in thinking about those two things, what might this case reveal about the relationship between diasporic movement and cultural memory practices?
So the idea that there is a kind of collective memory that is shared by a group in diaspora, as you know, has been interrogated a lot in anthropology and in so many other different disciplines. For this particular practice, I found it really, really interesting how little interrogated it was and perpetuated it was, despite its ubiquity. The villages from which these women came at one point in time were entirely full of tattooed women.
Mm-hmm.
All the women would have tattoos, and they were so ubiquitous that they weren't even commented or spoken about. And then after a certain age, I think it was the 1970s, the tattoo artist passed away, and this tradition entirely disappeared. I have the largest collection of these images in the Caribbean, as far as I know. And what that says about cultural memory for me is that it requires constant reinterrogation and reinterpretation for its perpetuation.
Yeah.
So it's not just that these tattoos became irrelevant to the peoples. There were these external forces acting upon it, as I tried to highlight, the forces of colonialism and ostracism and perceptions of heathenism and perceptions of backwardness that were associated with these markers, that were also associated with other markers of Indian identity within this community. So, for example, there are many stories and narratives that I have from people in their 70s whose cultural practices when they were growing up were seen as less legitimate, that in the 20, 30 years since have become part of this national identity, where Trinidad's national identity is multi-ethnic. So I think what I'm trying to articulate poorly is that dialectical relationship between relevance within the community through constant evolution and reinterrogation and external pressure that invalidates, undermines, and ostracizes these practices that people bring with them in a diaspora. I think the case of Trinidad and generally the older Indian diaspora is a bit unique because they had a number of factors working towards the formation of a shared identity, their isolation outside of the mainstream on these plantations, their on these plantations and afterwards in the villages near the plantations, their linguistic origins, like most of them spoke variants of Bhojpuri, Awadhi, or otherwise, um, and the pressures of colonialism as well, the pressures of having to share laboring practices on a plantation where everyone was rendered the same by oppression. So I think understanding that kind of dialectical relationship between external forces and internal churning to produce a new kind of identity lends itself to a collectivized memory and a sense of shared narratives about struggle and overcoming that struggle and arrival, all of which are, you know, are often contested in the space of Trinidad and I think elsewhere, where there are diasporas of people who are trying to rearticulate their identities in new spaces. I think that helps. Does it kind of make sense?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Any other questions?
Thank you all so much for staying on. I'm so sorry I was late. Any more questions?
Yeah, one more question.
Yes.
Could you speak a little bit to like the relationship between Godna and caste, like historically
Yeah.
within India?
So this is a huge rabbit hole I went down because caste as a defining social structure in India is, as we know, the ground state of a lot of scholarship. And when I was looking at the archival records from the Indian Antiquary, and there was so much data. There's a lot of information published by Luard and colonial ethnographers and the British civil servants slash ethnographers who were trying to categorize and describe India at that time. And what I learned was that the reason that there was this plethora of data trying to, there was a lot of data in which tattoos were itemized, described, and grouped according to castes and groups. And then I learned that actually it was a part of this effort to define and link caste with criminality in India and try to find whether there were certain social practices, certain markers that they could definitively say if you had this tattoo, then you were a part of this criminal group. Or, you know, if you had this tattoo, then, and it was linked to the whole genetics, this whole racializing notion of superiority of the races. And in some of the books from that period, they talk about the more refined and Aryan groups having fewer tattoos, and the more Dravidian and the lower down that social evolution of man, you went away from the Aryans to the Dravidians and the tribals, the more tattoos there were. However, what was really interesting was that despite extensive efforts that attempted to categorize all of this by caste, they did not find a clear one-to-one correlation. Many of the descriptions, in fact, overlap in terms of both the motifs and the practices, and I have this whole section on it that I've written up with a separate paper that I can't quote right now. But caste continues to be, so to go back to some of the ethnographic materials from the earlier period, from the late 1800s that were gathered in India, there are many quotes about Brahmins having tattoos, and there are many quotes about non-Brahmins having tattoos. So it seemed that tattooing was practiced by all castes. Whether there was a difference in the motifs is not very clear from the literature. But what was interesting was when I was talking in Trinidad to these women, I also tried to disentangle whether there was some kind of association with caste or nation or jati, as it's known in Trinidad. But that idea of caste is so absent in general Indian Trinidadian thought that the only people who were sure that they had received specific tattoos were the women who identified as Brahmin. So in Trinidad, what has happened is that the only people who retain some kind of a notion of their ancestral caste, 5 or 6 generations down, are those who identify as Brahmin. And there are a lot of critiques historically about the percentages of Brahmins we have in Trinidad, because Brahmin and caste description was a self-designated description that one told the colonial recorder when you were going on the ship. So a historian known as Brinsley Samaru has famously said, we have a lot of Brahmins by boat, not by birth, in the Caribbean and in Trinidad, which I think is a very interesting description. So whether there were, in fact, different motifs that were used, I cannot say for sure. Whether the motifs that were used, like, for example, with the inclusion of Ram Nam, which is not as common. I mean, there's a whole sect in India that are called Ram Namis, who inscribe the name of Ram continuously across their bodies. And they arose in resistance to Brahminical control of sacred texts in India. So they claimed, by inscribing on themselves, the sacrality of the name of God. This was not the case for the tattoos I found in Trinidad, but there was still a higher number of Ram Nam tattoos, and they were incorporated into the motifs differently. So who is to say what happened? I mean, all of this is cultural transformation in practice. Think of it like this. Think the Natwas and the Godnahars who in Trinidad did not come as Natwas and Godnahars. They did not come as tattoo artists. They were indentured laborers too. They were on the plantations along with everyone else. Their time expired. They either squatted on land or settled or bought. And then they took up this trade, whether it was something they had traditionally practiced in India, where they were itinerant tattoo artists as well, or whether it was something that they learned on the job. There were some very poor tattoos, I gotta say, that didn't stand the test of time. It is hard to say. But imagine these people from different parts of this stretch of India, going from village to village, transmitting what they know, and all together weaving together this notion of identity and community and meaning. Who is to say what fragments would piece together correctly or not, or to form what new wholes?
Thank you very much.
Thank you